Sylvia Farber is the visionary behind 101 Advocacy, brings wealth of expertise in her role as an owner and founder. Armed with a BA in Special Education and Elementary Education from Florida Southern College, as well as a master's degree in Special Education from Florida State University, Sylvia is deeply committed to empowering families and individuals navigating complexities of the special education system. Since 2008, Sylvia has been a steadfast advocate, guiding families through the maze of special education processes and ensuring that every child receives the support that they need to thrive. As a mother of 3 children, one of whom has a rare syndrome, Sylvia brings a deeply personal understanding to her work, fueling her passion for advocating for the rights and well-beings of individuals with special needs. Thank you for presenting, and please welcome Sylvia Farber.
All right, so I hope you guys are ready for a really fast presentation. Open up the brains, buckle your seatbelts. I've been told I have about an hour to do about 6. So get ready. So I do relate to you guys a lot with the rare syndrome, since my daughter does have a rare syndrome. And so I recognize the challenges that go along with that, and also the challenges of sometimes getting schools to recognize some of the difficulties that your child might have that's unique from other students that they're typically used to programming for. So I hope that you get some good information to go back to your school districts and that you feel empowered as a result of this presentation. I want to give a disclaimer that in Texas, we call the IEP meetings ARD meetings, and most of my work is in Texas. And so if you hear me say ARD, I really mean IEP. Okay, so those things are really synonymous. And also, I'm an educator by trade, so I'm not used to standing back here behind a podium. And so this is going to be very unnatural for me. I normally like to walk around, so I'm going to try my best to land here. I know there's people watching out there. Hey, everyone in virtual world. And I'm also not used to wearing heels since COVID, because I do a lot of work behind my computer. So I'm giving all these disclaimers up front. So if I can't stay here, if I take off my shoes, if I get a little bit too loud, that's me. All right, so you ready? Hopefully this is not how you feel when you go to an IEP meeting, but if it is, hopefully that will change after today's presentation. All right, so there's a lot of stuff that I hope you can become educated and empowered about when it comes to IEP meetings. The first thing is really you need to educate yourself. And there's a couple of tools that will really empower you to give you a lot of good, strong foundation. And the biggest one of that is the procedural safeguards. Are these slides going to be available to them? Okay, because I see some people taking pictures. I just want to know if they're going to be available. All right. So the procedural safeguards, every time you go to an IEP meeting, every time your child is evaluated, you get something called the procedural safeguards. You get so many of these that they become kind of, they're discarded usually, and they're never really looked at. But the procedural safeguards really is the meat and potatoes of your rights. If you will read through the procedural safeguards, you'll have a very strong understanding of what a school district's obligations are and what your rights are as a parent. So I strongly encourage you to read the document. And it's in pretty clear language. It's not a bunch of legalese language. So it is written fairly parent friendly. So please read the procedural safeguards. That will help you immensely in helping you understand your basic rights. Another thing is rightslaw.com, and that's WRIGHTS law.com. That is, to me, one of the #1 source of, if I have a question that I'm going to go and Google on rightslaw.com, I'm going to use their search engine to come up with some resources that are going to help me. They also have a yellow pages on that website if you needed help finding providers. If you needed help finding an attorney or an advocate, there's a yellow pages there that can help you with that as well. But that's a really good source of information. If you have a specific question about your rights, you can go to that website and usually find support there. You also need to know what the purpose of IDEA is. The purpose of IDEA is to educate your child for not only today's education, but also future education. And it's not just education, it's about future education, future employment, and future independent living. So when you're planning for that IEP, you have to use the lens for this coming year, but you also need to have your long-term goggles on as well and think about, how does this plan that we're going to make today for this next year, how is that plan going to help us accomplish the goals that we have for our child in 3 years, in 6 years, at graduation? So you really have to think about all of those factors when you're thinking about that IEP. And then also, don't let the district limit you in thinking about the plan can only encompass education. It can only encompass academic needs. That's definitely not true. The plan, if there is a need to help your child with future employment skills, social skills are really big for employment, right? It's hard to have a job if you don't have social skills. Behavioral skills are very important. It's hard to have a job if you have a lot of behavior. So those type of things would fall into that category of helping your child prepare for future employment and also future independent. If there are a lot of ADL skills, activities of daily living, if there's a lot of skills there that may be lacking, those skills are going to be necessary to try to help with the best independence possible. So it's not just about academic, it's about everything, preparing for future employment, independent living, and education. All right, I like this quote because I just think sometimes our kids get put in a box, but everybody's a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life thinking it's stupid. So we need to think about our kids in strength-based ways. It's super important. A lot of times, districts and schools, they like to think about our students in a weakness type mindset, but we need to help them shift that frame and think about our students in a strength-based mindset. Think about what they can do and build upon their strengths. And in doing that, evaluations is a big thing that comes up within special education as well. And evaluations, oftentimes, they are necessary. They're necessary to determine eligibility. You can't have special education support and services without eligibility. So evaluations are necessary to determine eligibility. But honestly, beyond determining eligibility, the standardized assessments aren't all that helpful because they don't help with the day in and day out programming. Oftentimes, there are times when those things are useful, but they're generally not extremely useful outside of eligibility. If there's any LSSPs in the room, I'm sure they're cringing in their seats because they like to evaluate. But you have to think, again, those evaluations don't really help you think about your child in strength-based ways. They're really looking at where the weaknesses of your child and comparing your child to the neurotypical child and age level norms. And if your child's in special education, then they're likely not meeting those age level norms. I would assume in HADS, I've seen some of the students here, that there's a big range of ability level, but you need to keep that in mind as you're looking at evaluations. And briefly, the bell curve is up there that tells you what average range is, below average range, and significantly below average range. Intellectual disability is something that you're eligible for if your IQ, and there's other factors that go into it as well, but typically, generally speaking, is below 70. Your child has HADS, so your child could likely qualify under OHI, other health impairment. I did a little bit of research on HADS and saw that a lot of children qualify under autism as well. And so OHI or autism may be your eligibility area. If your child has cognitive difficulties, it's not necessary that they also qualify as intellectual disability. They can qualify for intellectual disability, but it's not always necessary to put that label additionally on there. There could be other factors that go into why the child's performing in the way they are, and they may or may not truly have an intellectual disability. Autism oftentimes gets in the way of a student being able to really perform. Autism oftentimes gets in the way of the student being able to truly demonstrate the skill level that they really have. And so I have concerns when there is another disability like HADS, potentially under OHI, or like autism, that the intellectual disability, is that really what's going on here? I would suspect, or I would propose, that you would first look at the medical disability under OHI and possibly autism, if that's how your child's impacted, and then just consider if ID makes sense or not. The reason that I proceed with caution with intellectual disability is oftentimes it's not supposed to be this way, but I wouldn't have a job if everything was the way it was supposed to be, right? And so sometimes people program based on disability. It's not supposed to be that way, but sometimes that happens. And so you have an intellectual disability. Well, we have a special class for those people. We have a special class for those people who have intellectual disability. Again, it should not be that way, but unfortunately, it still happens that way. Not all the time. I pray that every single one of you lives in a district that doesn't do that. I pray for you for that. But if you come across that situation where they typically say, okay, we have a class for these kinds of students, intellectual disability does not determine where you get educated. That has nothing to determine where you get educated. That's just your eligibility. That's how you get your foot in the door to get services. The same thing with autism. That's not how you get programmed for. That's not how you get services. That's just the eligibility to get your foot in the door to get supports and services. You program based on needs. You program based on what are the needs of that child. So I'm saying all of this to say that every 3 years, an evaluation is considered whether it's necessary. It doesn't have to be done. Oftentimes school districts will say, well, it's 3 years, it's time to do evaluations. Those evaluations don't have to be done every 3 years. They just have to be talked about and considered every 3 years. So you can say thanks, no thanks. If there's evaluations that really just don't make sense, you don't need to evaluate for autism again. If you have autism, you have autism. It's a lifelong condition. You don't need to evaluate for that again. If you've already got some cognitive assessments and you feel like new assessments not going to help you with programming, you don't need to do any additional intellectual assessments. If your child's speech skills have remained the same and your speech therapist knows what their needs are by working with the child day in and day out, you don't have to do another speech evaluation. So evaluations are only necessary if it's going to help you with programming. They've already got the eligibility. It's only going to help you with programming. Sometimes evaluations, if they happen, it will dismiss a child from services. So if you're looking at speech therapy and they say, and your child is right on that cusp of almost having enough skills that they really may not need services again, and they do an evaluation, then that could be a disqualifier for your child receiving services. And so if you feel like your child still needs those services, then you might say no thank you to that evaluation, and then continue to look at what are the needs, because we program based on needs. What are the needs that we have here so that you continue to meet that child's needs, even without an evaluation that potentially could be dismissing them for those services. Assistive technology. So that is, and again, in looking at HADS, I see that some individuals do use communication devices. There is, I think this is my next slide I added for you guys. Yes. Okay. So there's a lot of just misinformation. Did the SLP talk about this earlier in her presentation? So I won't spend a lot of time here, but just make sure that you look at this document because there's a lot of misinformation out there with SLPs in regards and districts in regards to communication devices and how you use those devices. This is a great document from the Department of Education. So it's like the Bible, right? And so that's out there. It tells you, it dispels all the myths out there where, well, you have to be a certain age, you have to have a certain skill set, you have to, and so it tells you those things that aren't true, and then it gives you the truth. So if your child is potentially in need of a device, then please look at this. This would be a really good resource for you to go to that IEP meeting with so that you can be armed with information. Okay, then we're going to get into behavior. And so this also kind of stems with the intellectual disability. So sometimes intellectual disability or any behavior, students with autism, sometimes they're not fairly judged with their behavior. So sometimes, do you have a bad day? Do you want to be judged by your worst bad day? I sure don't want to be judged by my worst bad day. I remember a time my daughter broke her iPad, and of course I was telling her therapist about it. She broke the iPad, and then and I was telling the therapist she was having a tantrum, slammed the iPad down, broke it. And then my son, at the time says to the therapist, and you should have seen the tantrum my mom threw. So we don't want to be judged by those fourth stays, right? But if someone looked at me and throwing that tantrum, I could get an IEP about that. I could have some goals about that tantrum that I threw, but that's not my ongoing and typical behavior. I'm generally easygoing, but we don't need to be judged by a moment in time. We don't need to be judged by some of these behaviors that sometimes they tend to, now we're marked for the rest of our lives for these behaviors. And sometimes it's just an event and we need to get past it and not look at all behaviors that we have to then like have a huge meeting about everything. Some behaviors are typical. Sometimes middle school boys make dumb decisions. It's not about the disability. They're a middle school boy, they made a dumb decision, right? And so it happens. It doesn't always have to be attributed to the disability. And so I think sometimes we have to just remind other people when we're looking at behavior that we don't have to have, that doesn't always have to track for the rest of our lives. And we don't always have to look at that behavior, because sometimes when you create a BIP, behavior intervention plan on a behavior, you're putting that behavior underneath a microscope, right? So everyone's looking for that behavior, right? And do you always want everyone to be looking for that behavior? Sometimes it's appropriate. I'm not saying that it's not, but I just want to caution you to make sure that you're looking at the behaviors that are necessary to be looked at under a microscope, and that we're just not drawing attention to behaviors that maybe would just extinguish on their own with a little bit more maturity and time. So then that gets us to FBAs and BIPs. FBAs are functional behavior assessment. I got to take a drink of water. I'm going so fast. Hopefully you guys can keep up with the rate of speech that I'm going at. Okay, FBAs, functional behavior assessment. That is, if there is inappropriate or disruptive behavior, you would want to do an FBA. And an FBA is important because behavior is the biggest factor leading to removal from general education. We're going to talk about removal from general education a little bit more fully in a few minutes. But if there is behavior that is going to be most likely going to contribute to your child not being educated with non-disabled peers. So you want to address behavior that is significant to help make sure that student can continue to be educated with their non-disabled peers. A functional behavior assessment, that's not something that should be done by the classroom teacher. A functional behavior assessment needs to be treated like a real evaluation, not something that the classroom teacher is doing. It should be done by a behavioral specialist. It should be done by an autism specialist, a BCBA. It should be somebody who has additional expertise in schooling and behavior. The classroom teacher, as fabulous as she is too close to the situation. She's too close to really see the behavior. And as a parent, we're oftentimes too close to the situation of behavior to understand or to see what may be driving a behavior. Sometimes our own actions contribute to the student's behavior or escalation of behavior. The same thing with the classroom teacher. She's too close to the situation to see that she may be in fact triggering a behavior. So you need someone with outside eyes, someone that's not deeply associated with the child, to look at the child and be able to isolate the behavior, be able to look at the behavior for what it is and do an evaluation to understand, why is that behavior happening? What are the antecedents, the A to the behavior? And what are the consequences to the behavior? What's strengthening and maintaining that behavior? Because when you figure out the A's and the C's to the B, then that's how you're going to develop the behavior intervention plan. The behavior intervention plan is going to help you know what are the antecedents that we need to have in place to help prevent the behavior, or what are the consequences that we need to put in place to help strengthen, maintain, eliminate, or decrease the behavior. So those things are very important if behavior is a concern. I'm going to a little bit later talk about another piece of behavior that is for when there are more significant behavior, what to do then. Again, you want to focus on strengths. You want to focus on shaping behaviors. Behavior doesn't change overnight. Shamu didn't learn to jump and do flips and all that marvelous work overnight. Shamu learned to do that over time, and she also learned how to do that focusing on the strengths. Shamu learned to jump because when they first started to teach her, this is where I get hard to be constrained behind here. They put a rope on the bottom of the pool, and Shamu got rewarded when Shamu did what Shamu naturally did, which was swim back and forth across the pool. So here's a fish here, Shamu, here's a fish here, Shamu. And so Shamu was rewarded for doing what she naturally normally does. And they shaped that behavior by gradually raising the rope off the pool floor. And then Shamu would still swim across the pool, get her fish, gradually raise the rope until Shamu's jumping over the rope. Fish, fish. Now let's do some flips. And so Shamu was rewarded and by shaping the behavior. So they didn't expect Shamu from day 1 to day 2 to be doing flips. We should not expect that of our students either. We should shape the behavior in reasonable ways. And we start where the student's at and we build upon the strengths. Okay, so hopefully you can remember that Shamu story when you're in your school district and you're saying, we're going to build upon strengths here. We're going to meet my child where my child is at, and we're going to build slowly upon the strengths so that we can really, truly shape this behavior. All right, if you have a behavior intervention plan that does not bring about adult behavior change, then it's nothing more than professional doodling. We've got to bring about change. And it's not just about the student. The adults are going to have to change too. The adults have to change how they're interacting with the student. The adults have to change. If they don't, then it's not going to be an effective plan. All right, so now evaluations. If you disagree with an evaluation, you get an intellectual evaluation, a speech evaluation, and the speech therapist says, we're going to dismiss. The speech therapist says, you know what, I think she only needs 1 day a week of services. You get an evaluation and they say, no, I don't think the student needs occupational therapy. Or you get that behavior evaluation and the behavior, you put a plan in place, the behavior doesn't change, you need a new evaluation. Anytime you disagree with an evaluation or the results you wanted from that evaluation don't happen, you can request an IEE. That's an independent education evaluation. This is something that is paid for by the school district by a third party. So you get to choose the evaluator. It's a third party that's not employed by the school district, but the school district pays for it. And they're going to give you a list of providers. So if you needed that speech evaluation, they're going to give you a list of providers that are credentialed to provide that evaluation. You can choose from that list. But if you know that there's another provider that you want to use, then you can ask the district to use that provider. They just have to look to get that to make sure that person is credentialed appropriately to be able to do the evaluation. And then that person has to agree to the price that the district wants to pay for that evaluation. They have to work that out. But that is possible for you to choose an evaluator that's not on their list. They provide a list because it does have to be credentialed. So like for autism, your medical doctor is not going to be able to give the autism evaluation that the school district is likely going to accept. They're going to want an autism evaluation from a provider who looks at more than just the medical nature there. So it has to be credentialed, and the school district will help with providing that list and information of who can do that is credentialed. I think that's it there. All right, least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment is the regular education classroom, the general education classroom. The law favors least restrictive environment, which is synonymous for the regular education classroom. Research, over 30 years of research, supports students make more gains when they're educated in the general education classroom. So research and the law support that students should be educated in general education. They should only be removed from general education when supplementary aids and services and the student is not able to be successful. And it actually doesn't even, it's satisfactory. The word of the law is satisfactory. And so that's a vague term, right? What is satisfactory? So that's a vague term that you get to help determine when your students in general education, what is going to be the satisfactory determination there? Those goals and objectives are going to be the satisfactory determination of whether the child's successful in general education placement or not. But supports and services, that is accommodations, that's modifications, That's support that comes into the classroom. Those things all help a student to be successful in general education. All of that has to be explored and deemed not enough before the student is removed. Oftentimes, school districts remove students before they have exhausted and explored all the supports and services available. And so I hope that you can feel empowered to be that squeaky wheel, per se, to help them understand they need to do more exploration of the supports and services before they remove your child from the general education placement. One-to-one. So I don't know if your child needs more support than the neurotypical peer needs, but oftentimes this isn't as big of a deal as it used to be, but school districts would say one-to-one is the most restrictive setting, a one-to-one support, a one-to-one aid. Well, that's the most restrictive setting. Well, I want to make sure that you have this language. A one-to-one support or one-to-one aid is not a setting. That's a support. So that would go back to exhausting all supports and services before removal. A one-to-one is a support. A one-to-one is not a placement. Placement is the classroom. A one-to-one is not that. So you just need to know that needing a one-to-one is not a qualifier to say the student cannot be educated in general education. In fact, that's a good reason a student could be educated in general education, because they have the one-to-one support to hopefully help make that successful. One of my favorite quotes from the Americans with Disabilities Act is that independence is not measured by the number of tasks we can do without assistance, but by the quality of life we can lead with assistance. So oftentimes, well, one-to-one, that's the most restrictive, or one-to-one, they're negative about a one-to-one. And I'm not saying that everybody needs a one-to-one, please hear me. I think that most students don't need a one-to-one. But when a student does need a one-to-one, school districts are oftentimes still resistant to that. But a one-to-one can help a student to have more independence, not less independence. An example that I give, it would be unfathomable for someone in a chair to come up here and us to say, well, we want you to have more independence now, so let's take away the chair and let's see what you can do without the chair. Well, we'd never think about doing that. We wouldn't do that. So why do we take away the support that someone needs, even if it's a personal support? Why would we remove that if that's what this person needs? That helps the person be more independent, just like the chair helps someone be more independent. Without the chair, they would be less mobile. And so we just need to think about support in those realms, that it would be unfathomable to think that a chair makes someone less dependent. It makes someone more dependent. Same thing with support, personal support that can enable someone to be more independent, not less. Goals and objectives. This really is like a day-long meeting right here, just talking about that. So I'm going to obviously be brief about it, but goals and objectives drives placement. And so that's the biggest thing that you need to know about goals and objectives. If you desire a general education placement, then your goals need to be academic in nature, and your goals need to be able to be met within that general education classroom. If that's not your goal, and if you're comfortable with a self-contained classroom and that's where your child can best be educated, then functional goals can be more appropriate. It's very hard to have functional goals, especially as a student gets older, to be met in the general education classroom. And I'm not talking about ADL goals, because if a student's not able to independently toilet, somebody with CP that has an IQ of 130 may not be able to independently toilet, but we wouldn't put someone with an IQ of 130 in a self-contained classroom because they can't independently toilet. The same thing with any student, regardless of IQ, the need to be able to do all your ADLs and a toilet isn't a factor that keeps you in gen ed or keeps you out of gen ed. But just generally speaking, academic goals are more appropriate in the general education setting, and they have to be able to be met in the general education setting. And so, for instance, if you have an academic goal, and let's say the student is in, let's say the student's in 6th grade, the student's in 6th grade, and academically, let's say your student struggles with math and really math concepts, and this is my daughter. My daughter struggles significantly in math, and she really would be at single digit addition. Well, single digit addition isn't a skill that you do regularly in 6th grade math. And so you're going to have to look at the curriculum that's in 6th grade math, and what are some ways that that curriculum can be modified in such a way that your child can be successful in that curriculum. And it can happen. It sounds crazy to think, how can you modify that curriculum to a lower level? But it can happen, and you can even get specialists to help with modifications, but it can. Reading, if your child is reading, and again, 6th grade level, if your child is reading at a 1st grade level, you're not going to write a goal for your child to read 2nd grade material in a 6th grade classroom. But what you could do is say, given grade level material, and so that's the 6th grade material, given grade level material, the student will identify the main characters. Hopefully, the student we're talking about in a year, given grade level material, given what is that? Given Wonder. I don't know if that's 6th grade material or not, but that's probably around there. But given the book Wonder, the student wouldn't be able to comprehend potentially all of the conflicts within Wonder, all the character analysis within Wonder, but could they identify the main characters in Wonder? And if that's a skill that they could do, that would enable them to stay within the general education curriculum. Modifications to the curriculum help students to remain educated in the general education curriculum when they're not fully capable of achieving the same grade level standards. There's a couple ways to modify things. One is, let's say there are 20 standards. So there's 20 standards for that 6th grade reading classroom. That teacher is supposed to get through all 20 standards, and the student's supposed to learn all 20 of these standards. So one way to modify is the student learns 10 of the standards. So that's one way to modify, that they just learn less of the standards. Another probably better way to modify is these standards oftentimes will use those words like synthesize, analyze, evaluate. Those are harder words that the student may not be able to do. And so then you look at more words like identify, you look at determine, you can look at words that are more basic level information. What is the basic information? Does the child really need to understand all the factors that led up to World War II? I don't know. Can the child identify the main contributing political figures in World War II? That would be a way to modify that curriculum for that. So there's ways to modify it. So modification is shortening the expectation or reducing the expectation in such a way that they don't have to go to the deepest levels that the neurotypical peers are expected to go to. It's okay if they stayed up here at the service level. So that's one way to modify. And modifications to the curriculum is part of that supports and services that have to be explored before the child is removed from general education. When you have goals, you need to make sure they use words that are measurable: solve, identify, locate. Words like learn, understand. You can't see that. I can't see if you learned something, but I can see if you identified it. I can see if you located it. So those words are important because then you can actually measure the IEP. You can measure the goals and see if the student was successful on those or not. All right. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about making sure that students are appropriately supported. And when they are appropriately supported and they're doing well, let's keep it that way. We don't have to remove it just because they're doing well. They're doing well because we're properly supporting them. All right, monitor progress. So oftentimes, and hopefully you're in districts that do a better job with this, that I very often will see a progress report, and you're supposed to get a progress report every time there's a report card. Oftentimes I'll see progress reports that will say, good progress. I love Joey. Joey's such a fun kid to have in class. Oh my goodness, what a great reader he is. Joey's a sixth grader, says he's a great reader. Does that mean he's reading on grade level? I don't know, because it didn't tell me that information. Tell me how much you love Joey doesn't tell me if Joey can read sixth grade material. It doesn't tell me if Joey can identify the main characters in the story. So the progress report should reflect data-driven information specific to the goal. So if the goal is identify the main political, I'm drawing a blank on the right word that I want to say, political figureheads. That's not what I want to say, but if it's identifying the political figures, thank you, of World War II, does the progress report match that he was able to do that? So the progress report and the data should both match and tell you information about how the student did specific on the goals. And it should use information like 75%. It should tell you we had 4 trials. He did 60% on this, 75% on this, 80% on that. That's one example for you to know that there's some data-driven information here. In the last 3 sentences, he was able to spell words correctly 80% of the time. Whatever the goal is, the progress report should tell us specific information about that goal so that you can gauge progress about how he did on the goals and not that he was just a fun kid to have in class. All right, lesser known rights. Extended school year services. And so that is essentially summer school for students with special needs. Most of the time, and I primarily work in Texas, and so I'm not familiar with all your state regulations clearly, but Texas specifically, and I know a lot of other states like to say ESY services are just for students who have had significant regression. And that's not the case. That is a primary way, a normal, usual way to say if a student needs services is if there's been significant regression. But another way to say, does the student need ESY services, is if without services, would you think that the student may be in a more restrictive placement coming the next year? So if you didn't continue working on the goals, might we be having a conversation, oh, Joey just can't make it in this classroom anymore. We need to put him in a different class. If that's the case, then ESY services may be appropriate. So that's another reason for ESY services is if you suspect there may be a need for a more restrictive placement in the future and summer services would help prevent that, that's another way to justify ESY services. And that's not a common way that's usually done to justify ESY services. Related services, music therapy is a related service. Sometimes parents don't know about related services, but if music can help a child meet their goals, then music therapy may be appropriate. Counseling services, a lot of times parents don't know about that. Does the child need counseling services where there's an actual psychologist that works with the child to provide those services? And that's not the school guidance counselor. This is a real certified counselor that can work with your child to provide services. And so oftentimes parents just think the guidance counselor is the only thing available to the student, but there's not. Counseling services is another potential option. Parent training. So it's possible that you could have got your conference registration fees paid for to attend this by your school district. That could be under parent training. So you heard me say my daughter has a rare syndrome. Every single year of her conference, the school district pays for us to go to that conference because that conference, it's a rare syndrome, is the only place that we're going to get additional education and information specific to her disability. So if there is something specific about the HADS conference that you're not going to get from your school district, then them paying the registration fees to come here may be appropriate. So if your child has autism and you want more information about autism, coming to the HADS conference probably isn't going to be the answer for that because districts are well versed in autism. But if it's something HADS specific in addition to autism, then it's very possible. that you would show the program outline. Here's all the experts that are speaking here. Here's why I need to come to this conference, because this is the only place where I have access to people who have researched the syndrome, who are educated on the syndrome, and can help us make better plans for how to help our daughter with their future, education, future employment, future independent living. So we plan for all three of those things. Does this conference help you do that? If it does, then you possibly could get them to pay for the conference fees under parent training. I say conference fees because if you ask for transportation, if you ask for them to do the hotels, you're probably going to get a harder no. You can ask for those things, and then you could work with the school district potentially to get some of those things. But districts rarely pay for their staff to go to out-of-state conferences. So they're probably not going to pay for your travel to go to an out-of-state conference. So you could ask, but in my experience, you're much more successful getting the conference registration fees paid for. I don't know how much they are here. For the conference we attend, it's like $350 to go, which is a pretty substantial amount of money that I can save and do something else that my daughter needs, because it's expensive having these children, right? So parent training, you could potentially get that paid for. And if it's not the HATS conference, but there's something else that you need training on that's specific to your child's disability, then you can potentially ask for parent training for that. Teacher training. Does your teacher need more training specific to understanding HADS? Does the teacher need more training because they don't know how to use the communication device? Does the teacher need more training in order to properly educate your student? You can ask for teacher training. Ratios. If the student doesn't need a 1-to-1, but the student needs a ratio where the student is successful in a smaller class or with a smaller group setting. And so sometimes they'll have an inclusion class and they'll put 10 special needs students in that classroom. And then there's 12 neurotypical students. So 22 students total, and they have one teacher and one aide in that classroom. Maybe that's not enough support for your student. Maybe your student needs a smaller ratio than that, and your student does best if it's a 1-to-5 ratio. So you can put ratios in the yard that your student needs to be educated in a 1-to-5 ratio. And you can specify, because they're not going to want to necessarily say 1-to-5 ratio all day long, but what are the specific times that your student may need that ratio? And maybe they need 1-to-1, but maybe they don't need 1-to-1 all day. Maybe they need 1-to-1 instruction specifically in math for 45 minutes a day. Maybe they need 1-to-1 instruction specifically in some sort of ADL, and they need that for 15 minutes a day. So you can specify ratios, and you can specify what is necessary for that ratio. It's whatever the child needs, right? This is not a cookie cutter IEP. It's what does the child need to prepare for this year, keeping in mind that we want the child to be successful for future independent living, education, and employment. So what are those things that the child needs to help us get there? And if ratios or a smaller ratio or some specific instruction and at a certain time of day is necessary, then you can talk through that. Compensatory services. If the school district doesn't follow the IEP, if they don't meet all the components of the IEP, if the speech therapist was supposed to provide 27 sessions and they only provided 20 sessions, you can get compensatory services for that. The service is made up. That's more common when they don't meet a specific service time. And this has been, I have a lot of cases with this because staffing is a big issue in Texas. I don't know if it's a big issue where you live, but we have a lot of unfilled positions in Texas. And when those positions aren't filled, that IEP is not being met. And so if that IEP is not being met because of staffing shortages, that's terrible, right? I feel bad for the district, but your child is still due those services. And so you can ask for compensatory services because they weren't able to meet the child's needs because they didn't have the right staffing to be able to implement the IEP. So compensatory services oftentimes are during the summer. It can be after school, it can be before school, it could be, it's usually not during the school day because that day is already programmed for, right? You already have all those minutes accounted for. Sometimes things happen and it makes sense for everyone for it to happen during the school day, but usually it wouldn't happen during the school day. Usually it would be outside the school day. And because the day is already so long, it's hard to do that during the school year. So oftentimes, if the child needs compensatory services, that's during the summer. It doesn't mean that the child just gets put in ESY and now the child's in ESY and that's compensatory services. It could be that, but that's not necessarily what it has to be. So you just need to be very thoughtful on what is the programming that the child missed and what is the best way to make up that programming. And if just putting the child in the ESY services to satisfy that is good, fine. But if that doesn't meet the child's needs, then you need to come up with another plan for ESY, for compensatory services, even though it may be during the ESY timeframe that they have scheduled, because that's when they have staff on duty at that time. So MDR, that's when there's more significant behavior. So more significant behavior in your child, potentially, they might be talking about a removal to an alternative campus. So MDR, that's manifestation determination review meeting. So if the behavior is significant, they can only remove a child from the placement for 10 days before you have to have the MDR. And so if they call you and say, hey, Joey's having a bad day, you want to come get him? They're getting away with that. Having you come pick them up, that doesn't count as one of those 10 days. That's a parent choice. You just chose to come get your kid and sign him out that day. So that doesn't count as one of those days. So, and I'm not telling you to never do that. I mean, there were times that I did do that for my child, but there are also times when I said, no, are you suspending? Well, we weren't planning to suspend. Well, if you're going to suspend, I will come get my child. If you're not suspending, have a great rest of the day. Because if they're suspending, that's when it counts for the 10 days. It doesn't count to the 10 days when you just come pick up the child. So sometimes, and this is a big problem when there's a behavior with kids, especially kids who have disabilities that we know the behavior is because of the disability. A lot of times districts will just call mom and dad and they'll have them on, I'm drawing a blank on the word, speed dial, thank you. They have them on speed dial and parent is up there all the time picking up their kid, but nothing ever changes. Nothing ever changes because we didn't trigger MDR. MDR is only triggered when a student's removed for 10 days. So it has to be a suspension, and suspensions stink, but so does coming to pick your kid up and having to miss work for that too. So let the 10 days happen, and then you have to have an MDR and you have to really talk about, is the behavior and disability linked? If the behavior and disability is linked, they cannot continue to discipline your child as they would a neurotypical child. So those phone calls would have to stop. They would have to come up with another plan to meet the child's needs. If the behavior and disability are not linked, then they can continue to discipline the child as they would a child without disabilities. But most of the time, disability and behavior are linked. And of course, there are times when kids just make boneheaded decisions, but oftentimes disability and behavior are linked. And so when those are linked, the MDR would be triggered, and then those behaviors, they couldn't continue to suspend, they couldn't continue to call you if the behavior and disability is linked. But you do have to come up with a better plan because clearly the plan in place doesn't work. So then you're going to go back to that FBA. You're going to go back, request some IEEs. We got to do something different. We can't continue doing the same thing, thinking we're going to expect different results. So when behavior is a problem and they're calling you constantly about that, you got to get other people in the room. You got to get other experts in the room so that we can make changes to behavior and see a positive change there instead of continuing to call you. All right, number 2, prior written notice. So if you ask the school district for something and they say, no, we can't do that, you really need to get to the bottom of, is it you can't or you don't want to? And so you need to ask more questions about that, because oftentimes it's not a can't. The law isn't very specific about what they can't do. The law is very specific about what they have to do, right? So it's very rare that they wouldn't be able to do something because of some regulation. So when they say they can't do it, it's rarely because of a regulation. It's more likely because they don't want to do it because of staffing. They don't want to do it because whatever reason, it's not fair. They don't want to do it. And so you need to get to the bottom of, is it you can't or you don't want to? And then you can have the right conversation. And so when they say they can't, then you say, show me the regulation that says you can't do what I'm asking you to do. It's very unlikely that a regulation exists that they can't do something. And if that's not the case, okay, then now let's talk about why you don't want to do this. And then have that conversation about why they don't want to do that. And then if they continue to refuse what you're asking for, there's something called prior written notice, and you should be getting this every time you have a meeting. And they have to document their refusal in writing and the reasons that they're refusing. Oftentimes, they don't want to document a refusal and put the reasons in writing for why. And so oftentimes they'll just tell a parent no, and the parent doesn't necessarily know to say, okay, you're saying no, so let's put that in writing. Document that in prior written notice with your reason why. And then when you require them to document it as they're required to do, prior written notice isn't just about agreements. That's what they tend to like to do, is just put those agreements in place. Prior written notice is also about refusals. So when something is refused, to make sure they're documenting it and the reasons why. Oftentimes you'll get then, well, let's talk about it a little bit more. And then you'll have some more conversation about that. And oftentimes you don't get to the no, you get to a different happy medium. All right. And I know during this course of this conversation, I might feel like I'm bashing districts. That's not my intent. If there's any educators in the room, I highly respect you and admire you. So I'm not bashing districts. I'm just trying to make sure that you're educated. It's a hard job. I would go work at Costco before I had to go back into the classroom. It's a really hard job, and teachers are expected to do way more than they should have to do. But this is your child. It's your baby. You want your child's needs to be met. And that's who you're there to advocate for, is your baby. And so I know their job is hard, but you need to make sure your child gets everything that your child can. So I just want to make sure you know that. I know that school districts and teachers aren't sitting at home every night. Ooh, how can we make Joey's life miserable tomorrow? They're not doing that. They're great people. They do a good work, but sometimes lose sight of the individualized aspect of the IEP. And so I hope that you can become more empowered about putting that individualized aspect back into your child's IEP, so that it's not a cookie cutter IEP, that your child is specific to your child and can help your child become the best child that your child can be. All right, the last thing is make sure that you're an active participant. Ask questions, make a list of questions, go with your questions, ask your questions in advance, make it known what you're asking for. Oftentimes that helps them to give time to process what you're asking for and them to consider what you're asking for. It's very hard sometimes for them to be able to make a decision right there at that meeting table, even though they should be able to do it because it's an IEP committee that makes the decisions, and someone outside the committee isn't supposed to be making decisions. But the reality is oftentimes they have to get something blessed by someone outside the ARD committee. And by asking things in advance allows them to collaborate and get some information prior to that IEP meeting, so that hopefully you can be successful at the first time and not have to disagree or have to reconvene. You can ask for a draft in advance of the meeting so that you can see in advance what are their proposals. What goals do they want for your child? What service times do they want for your child? What placement do they want for your child? You can ask for that draft so you have a chance to process it. You have a chance to review it. You have a chance to ask questions and even offer revisions back to the school district. I do not go to meetings without a draft because it's like, you're just walking very uninformed into a meeting, and it's just not effective. So we always have a draft going into a meeting so that we can be able to process what it is the school district is recommending, and that we have a time to think through those and then offer some suggestions back to the district. Consider making a vision statement and sharing a vision statement. So this is the vision statement that we had for our daughter. We started the meetings, every single meeting, we started sharing the vision statement so that this is how we make decisions. We want everything to focus back onto the vision that we have for our child. This isn't the vision that we're just looking at for kinder or third grade. This is the vision that we have for her after the yellow bus stops. And that's what we need to be looking at, is my vision, and how are we going to accomplish this vision for Austin? And so this was the vision that we had for her through all of her schooling. She's 21 now. Her vision hasn't been fully realized yet. She did go to a secondary campus, a community college, and took some classes there, but she didn't live on campus. And that was my ultimate dream for her, but that didn't happen. But maybe there's still time. But that vision helped us keep moving forward with some very high hopes for her. And it made everyone in that room make sure that they looked at her with this in mind. So I think a vision statement is a really powerful tool to start your meetings with. All right, so before we start questions, I hope you feel empowered that this isn't you at your next meeting. All right, I think I have been an hour. I don't know how much. So, but I have time for questions or no? Okay.
Hi, so my son is 3. We just had his IP meeting, and it's great. We live close to Boston, and yeah, the district is amazing there. But one of the things that at this age, they just have a short day. So it's from 8:30 to 11:30. And of course, it's not as much as he had before the daycare that he was. Is there a way to talk to them to expand? Because I know that the next year there will be until 2:15, I think. Or is that something that is regulated by appropriate age or something like that, or something to fight for?
It's a very common placement service time. I mean, so it's very common to serve students 3-year-olds half day. It's super, super common. But does that meet your child's needs? And so that's the question. And so it can't be because we work and we need more time, right? It can't be because of that. It can't be because it's hard for us to get there. I mean, it has to be because your child needs more services, needs more support, needs something more than 3 hours. So you would have to look at, what are the goals? Does he need more goals? And those goals can't be accomplished within that 3-hour time frame. So therefore he needs more service time. So can it happen? Yes. Would it be an easy ask? Probably not. But the biggest thing, if you decided to ask for that more, is what does he need? And it has to be based on his needs. And he needs more time than the 3 hours. Why? And so you would have to justify, why is 3 hours not sufficient? What else does he need that's currently not in that program? Because the program he has now, it can be met in 3 hours. So you would have to justify that he needs something more than what's currently in the program to justify more time. But it is a very, very common service time.
And with that, we first need him to stay a little bit longer. Like for everything that you said, it need to justify. We need them to stay with the program for a longer time, like for a few months, to really show that it's not enough. Like the services, he's not getting closer to the goals because he's not having enough time, or he's not having enough therapies and things like that. So it's kind of like a trial with all the districts, or something that is there a way to prove without having this trial?
But there's 2 ways to do trials. There's a way to do trial to wait for something doesn't work, right? And that's how school districts normally like to do trials, is let's wait till something doesn't work and then we'll try something new. But you can also try something else that proactively that you believe will work. And then if it's not necessary, then you go back on something else. So there's two ways to do trials. It's just not proactively isn't the usual way that school districts do it. But what other evaluation support, what other from the ECI providers, do you have additional information that would support the 3 hours isn't enough? And so you can ask for that before he starts school to say, this just isn't enough. After we've had time to evaluate it, he needs more time than this. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be the full day, right? Maybe he just needs 1 more hour. And so they can provide, it's different. It's thinking outside the box, but that's possible. This is an individualized meeting, right? So he needs 1 more hour, and I don't know if he gets transportation or not, but they can still send a bus an hour later to take him for transportation. So those things can happen. It's thinking outside the box to meet his needs. It's not 3 hours or 6 hours. It could be 6. I mean, 3, it could be 4 hours. It could be 5 hours. But what does he need? That's what you're going to have to do the basis on, is driving, because needs drive all decisions. So you have to focus on the need.
I have a question. Thank you for this talk. This is really helpful. But I do feel like it's a bit overwhelming for parents just to have to know all of this and keep track of it. And I live in Houston, and so dealt with actually Fort Bend ISD. And I'm just wondering if there's any other suggested strategies or things to do when you really need to push back about what they're providing. I know that's kind of vague, but the website or the link, that's really helpful. I didn't know if there's anything else. If you know they're not providing enough, like we had an experience of them not providing enough resources, but there were just lots of excuses, including like, well, we're really going above and beyond. And it was like 15 minutes of an intervention a month. I mean, it was ridiculous. And then blaming it on resources, which is not really our
It's not your-
problem, but then
right.
what are you supposed to do? I mean, it felt very frustrating. And I also felt bad for them, because like a lot of that's not necessarily their fault, but they're sort of set up to fail to meet your kid's need. And it just felt very helpless. Like, this is all what's supposed to happen, but then what are you really able to do if it's just not?
Well, asking for them to put the denial in writing. I mean, that's a huge strategy. I mean, that's something that parents oftentimes don't do. Parents oftentimes don't exercise. It's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to do that. And so parents oftentimes don't do that. I mean, I get hired just to be the bad guy, but I'm not a bulldog with lipstick. I mean, I am very pleasant. And so when people hire me, I make sure they know I'm not a bulldog with lipstick. I'm not going in there beating my chest and demanding things, right? We're going to go in there in a collaborative manner. So I think collaboration is very key. But with collaboration is also assertiveness. And sometimes families have a hard time with that, because these are relationships that they're going to have for a long time, right? And families feel uncomfortable about hurting a relationship. And I certainly get that. But being assertive and being collaborative, and not necessarily when you're saying that you disagree with something or put that disagreement in writing, directing that to the person. The teacher's not the one that's making those decisions, right? When the teacher's saying no, it's because someone's told her to say no, right? The teacher's going to want to do everything possible for your child, but there's somebody else, the LEA, the local education agency, whoever, usually the principal or a district representative, that's the person who's saying no. And so then that's the person that you talk to and say, then you need to put that in writing. And that relationship usually isn't as critical of a relationship for you as the teacher. So I would just try to turn your assertiveness and your disagreement more so to the person who is actually the one that's in charge of the decisions and not the teacher. But asking them to put those in writing, it's a strong strategy that families often don't use to keep the conversation going. You may not get exactly what you're asking for, but you can get someplace close if you continue the conversation. And so sometimes families get very frustrated because the school district said no, the family said okay, they signed. Well, it doesn't no usually doesn't mean no. Usually no just means we haven't got to a yes yet. And so just don't take the no, just keep talking and keep working it out until you get to the yes that you're comfortable with. And there are free supports and services. Disability Rights of Texas is one support, your local, what's it called? Legal Aid. Legal Aid also has educational services for families. And so whatever your state's disability rights group is, they can provide services. A legal aid can provide services. And of course, there's professional advocates. I mean, I get hired oftentimes just to come in so the family doesn't have to be the one that is asking the hard questions and is continuing to push the conversation. I don't know if that really helped you to have a strategy.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Come in there with some books that say legal law stuff on it.
Good idea.
Rights Law has books. Just buy the books. Rights Law books, and they have a whole IDA book that you can just pop down. Oh, and let it just fall out of your handbag or something. Thank you so much.
Sorry, just one. Hi, so we're from the UK and our daughter's 2 years old. So we're at the really early stages right now, but over there, the system's slightly different. We have to fill out like a disability allowance form. Once that gets processed, then there's like an educational care plan that gets created for her. So at the moment, we're starting to think about nursery, which is, I guess you guys call it preschool. So right now we've been advised two options. So one is to send her to a specialist nursery or a normal nursery that will have special care for her. So we're just a bit confused as to what to do. And I was just wondering if you had any advice on that.
Research supports general education placement. And I'm happy, my email's in the presentation. I'm happy to send you the research that you can review. Anybody that wants to review the research on inclusion, I'm happy to send that to you. I don't know your child clearly, but I know the research, and over 30 years of research, every single piece of research says that students make better gains regardless of disability, regardless of the severity of disability in the general education placement. Does that mean that there's not reasons to remove? Certainly there's reasons to remove, but the research overwhelmingly supports a general education placement. So, I mean, I would encourage you to read the research so that you can make an informed decision.
Thank you.
Yeah.